Frank stood at the viewport of Docking Bay 7 and watched the last transport ship pull away from the station. The vessel's engines glowed blue against the black void of space, growing smaller and smaller until it was just another point of light among the stars. Then it jumped to hyperspace, and Frank was alone. He let out a long breath and turned away from the window. The docking bay was dark and cold, with only emergency lights casting weak red pools on the metal floor. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the station groaning and creaking, the sound of old metal settling and shifting in the endless cold of space. Outpost Sigma 7, his new home, his final home. Frank walked slowly through the corridors, his boots echoing on the grated floors. He was 63 years old, and his body felt every one of those years. His knees ached from decades of crawling under vehicles and machinery. His hands, once steady enough to perform surgery on a starship engine, now trembled slightly when he was tired. His lungs burned with every deep breath, the nanoplague eating away at them cell by cell. The doctors on Earth had given him 18 months, maybe less if he pushed himself too hard. They had wanted to keep him in a hospital, hooked up to machines that would breathe for him when his lungs finally gave out. They had talked about comfort and dignity and making the most of his remaining time. Frank had listened politely, nodded at all the right moments, and then used his entire pension to buy this abandoned station at the edge of known space. He did not want comfort. He did not want dignity. He wanted to work with his hands until they stopped working. He wanted to fix things and build things and take broken machinery apart and put it back together again. He wanted to die the way he had lived, covered in grease and sweat and honest labor. The station's main corridor stretched ahead of him, disappearing into darkness. Most of the lights had failed years ago, and the emergency power was barely enough to keep the air flowing. Frank pulled a flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the walls. Rust. Everywhere he looked, he saw rust. The station had been abandoned for 40 years, left to slowly decay in the cold void between stars. The mining company that had built it went bankrupt during the Second Expansion War, and no one had bothered to come back for the equipment. It was too far from the shipping lanes, too expensive to salvage, too worthless to care about. Perfect. Frank found the main reactor room after 20 minutes of walking. The door was stuck, the hinges frozen with age and neglect. He spent 10 minutes working on them with a can of lubricant and a wrench before the door finally groaned open. The reactor was old, a fusion design that had been obsolete before Frank was born. But it was still functional, still humming quietly to itself in the darkness. Frank walked around it slowly, running his hands over the control panels, checking the readings, feeling the gentle vibration of contained power beneath his fingertips. 40% output, just enough to keep the station alive. But Frank could see a dozen things that needed fixing, 100 small problems that added up to one big inefficiency. Given time and parts, he could bring the reactor up to full power. He could light up this whole station, make it warm and bright and alive again. He smiled for the first time in months. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work. Frank fell into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. He would wake up in the small quarters he had claimed near the reactor, eat a simple breakfast of reconstituted rations, and then spend the entire day working on the station's systems. He started with life support because that was the most important thing. The atmospheric processors were clogged with decades of dust and debris, their filters so dirty that Frank was amazed they still worked at all. He spent 3 days taking them apart, cleaning every component by hand and putting them back together again. When he was done, the air in the station tasted cleaner, fresher, like a weight had been lifted from his chest. Then he moved on to the water recycling system, which was even worse than the air processors. The filters had not been changed in 40 years, and the storage tanks were lined with a thick layer of mineral deposits. Frank had to fabricate new seals from scrap metal and synthetic rubber, his hands working from memory as he shaped the materials into the precise forms he needed. After water came heat. The station's thermal regulation system was a mess of failed sensors and broken conduits, leaving some sections freezing cold while others were uncomfortably warm. Frank spent a week crawling through maintenance shafts, replacing damaged components and rerouting power to the sections that needed it most. With each repair, the station came a little more alive. Lights flickered on in corridors that had been dark for decades. Doors that had been stuck for years began to open and close smoothly. The constant groaning and creaking of stressed metal grew quieter as Frank reinforced weak points and sealed microfractures in the hull. He was happy. That surprised him more than anything else. He had come here to die, but instead he found himself looking forward to each new day, each new problem to solve, each new challenge to overcome. The work gave him purpose, gave him a reason to get out of bed in the morning and keep moving even when his lungs burned and his joints ached. 3 months passed. Frank had lost track of the exact date, but he knew it was somewhere around that mark because he had to refill the food synthesizer with raw materials. He was in the cargo bay, sorting through the supplies he had brought with him, when the proximity alarm screamed to life. The sound was so unexpected that Frank dropped the crate he was carrying. It had been 3 months since he had heard any sound other than his own voice and the humming of machinery. The alarm was shrill and urgent, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Frank moved as fast as his old body would allow, pulling himself through the corridors toward the observation deck. The station's sensors were old and unreliable, but they were still capable of detecting approaching objects. Something was coming, something big enough to trigger the warning system. He reached the observation deck and stared through the viewport. At first, he saw nothing but stars. Then his eyes adjusted and he spotted it. A ship, but not like any ship Frank had ever seen. It was organic somehow, its hull covered in scales that shimmered between purple and gold. The shape was wrong for a human vessel, too curved and flowing, like something that had grown rather than been built. And it was on fire, sections of its hull burning with pale blue flames as it spiraled toward the station. Frank watched in frozen amazement as the ship tried to correct its course. He could see attitude thrusters firing, small jets of flame pushing against the vessel's rotation. But the damage was too severe. The ship was going to crash, and it was going to crash into his station. He had maybe 30 seconds to react. Frank ran. His lungs screamed in protest, and his knees threatened to buckle with every step. But he ran anyway because that was what you did when disaster was coming. You ran toward it, not away from it. He reached docking bay 3 just as the ship hit. The impact threw him off his feet, sent him tumbling across the floor as the station shuddered and groaned around him. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut, sealing off the damaged section. Alarms blared from every speaker, warning of hull breaches and atmospheric loss. Frank pulled himself upright and checked the display panel by the door. The bulkheads were holding. The breach was contained to docking bay 3. The rest of the station was safe, at least for now. He should leave it alone. That was the smart thing to do. Whatever had crashed into his station was probably dead, and even if it was not his problem. He had come here to be alone, to die in peace without anyone depending on him. But Frank was a mechanic. He had spent his entire life fixing things, saving things, keeping things alive that should have died. He could not just walk away and leave someone to suffocate in the wreckage. He grabbed an emergency suit from the locker by the door and pulled it on over his clothes. The suit was old, patched in a dozen places, but it would hold atmosphere long enough for him to reach the crash site. He grabbed a plasma cutter and a med kit, checked his oxygen levels, and cycled through the airlock. Docking bay 3 was a disaster. The alien ship had punched through the outer hull and carved a path of destruction across the floor before coming to rest against the far wall. Debris was everywhere, chunks of metal and strange organic material scattered across the deck. The atmosphere had vented, leaving the bay in hard vacuum. Frank approached the ship carefully, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Up close, he could see that the vessel was even stranger than he had thought. The scales that covered the hull were not metal, but something that looked almost like skin. They flexed and rippled even now, as if the ship itself was still alive, still trying to breathe. He found the hatch near the front of the vessel, a circular opening that had been forced open by the impact. Frank climbed through, his suit scraping against the strange organic walls. The interior was dark and full of smoke. Frank switched to infrared, and the world became a wash of reds and oranges. He moved forward, stepping over broken equipment and fallen panels, until he reached what looked like a command center. That was where he found her. She was lying on the floor, half buried under debris. Her skin was covered in scales that shifted from deep violet to pale silver. Two small horns curved back from her forehead, and her hair was long and dark, spread out around her like a pool of shadow. A pair of leathery wings lay crumpled beneath her body, bent at angles that made Frank wince just looking at them. She was breathing, barely. Frank could see her chest rising and falling in shallow, irregular gasps. He cleared the debris from her body, working quickly but carefully. Her injuries were severe. Compound fracture in her left leg, the bone visible through the torn flesh. Deep gash across her ribs, blood seeping out in a slow but steady stream. Multiple cuts and bruises covering her face and arms. Frank had seen wounds like this before, on battlefields scattered across a dozen worlds. He knew what they meant. Without immediate treatment, she would be dead within the hour. He worked fast. The compound fracture first, because that was the most dangerous. He used scrap metal from the wreckage to fashion a splint, binding it to her leg with synthetic bandages from his med kit. The bone was not set properly, but it would hold until he could do a better job. Then the gash on her ribs. He cleaned the wound as best he could, flushing it with antiseptic solution, and then sealed it with medical foam. The foam expanded to fill the wound, stopping the bleeding and creating a temporary barrier against infection. Her breathing was getting weaker. Frank checked his oxygen supply. He had maybe 20 minutes left, not enough time to get her back to the pressurized section of the station. He made a decision. Frank pulled the emergency oxygen mask from his suit and fitted it over her face. The mask was designed for human anatomy, but it covered her nose and mouth well enough. He adjusted the flow rate, giving her as much oxygen as the small tank could provide. Then he picked her up, cradling her in his arms like a child. She was lighter than he expected, maybe 60 or 70 pounds despite being nearly as tall as he was. Her wings hung limply over his arms, the leathery membranes torn and bleeding. Frank carried her through the wreckage of her ship, through the airlock, through the damaged corridors of his station. His lungs burned. His arms shook. His vision started to blur around the edges, but he kept moving, one step at a time, because stopping meant dying and he was not ready to die just yet. He made it to the pressurized section with 3 minutes of oxygen left in his tank. The airlock cycled, atmosphere rushed in, and Frank collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. But he did not rest for long. The girl was still dying and he had work to do. He carried her to his quarters, the only section of the station with a proper bed. He laid her down gently, stripped off his suit, and got to work. For 3 days, Frank did not sleep. He barely ate. He worked with the desperate focus of a man who had kept dying soldiers alive in the mud and blood of a dozen worlds. He set her broken leg properly, using a portable bone knitter he had salvaged from an abandoned medical station years ago. He stitched up the cuts on her face and arms, his hands steady despite the exhaustion. He rigged a makeshift IV, feeding nutrients and medication into her bloodstream. Her wings were the hardest part. The membranes were torn in several places, and 2 of the supporting bones were fractured. Frank had no idea how to treat alien biology, so he improvised. He splinted the broken bones with thin metal rods, and he patched the torn membranes with synthetic tissue grafts, the same material he used to repair hull breaches. On the third day, her fever spiked. Frank sat by her bedside, changing the cold compresses on her forehead every few minutes, watching her body fight against the infection that had taken hold. He talked to her even though she could not hear him, telling her about his life, about the wars he had fought, about the wife he had loved and lost. On the fourth day, the fever broke. Her breathing stabilized. Her heart rate settled into a steady rhythm. And on the fifth day, she opened her eyes. They were amber like pools of liquid gold, with vertical slits for pupils. They focused on Frank's face, and for a long moment, neither of them moved or spoke. Then she opened her mouth and made a sound. It was like singing mixed with the crackle of fire, beautiful and strange and completely incomprehensible. "I don't understand," Frank said. His voice was hoarse from 3 days of one-sided conversation. "Do you speak Standard?" She made another sound, this one shorter and sharper. Then her hand moved to her throat, touching a small device embedded in the skin just below her jaw. The device sparked and crackled, and suddenly her voice changed. "Where am I?" The words were halting, the accent strange, but Frank could understand them. "Who are you? What happened?" "Name's Frank," he said. "Frank, you crashed your ship into my station about 5 days ago. You were pretty badly hurt, but I patched you up as best I could." She tried to sit up and gasped in pain. Frank put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Easy now. You've got a broken leg, broken ribs, and your wings are in pretty rough shape. You're not going anywhere for a while." She lay back down, her amber eyes studying his face. "You saved me." "Tried to anyway. You're still alive, so I guess I did something right." "Why?" The question was simple, direct. "You do not know me. I am not of your species. Why would you risk yourself to save me?" Frank was quiet for a moment. It was a fair question, and he was not sure he had a good answer. "Because you were dying," he said finally, "and I was there. That's all the reason I ever needed." She stared at him for a long time. Then slowly she reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm, her scales smooth against his weathered skin. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for my life." Her name was, or at least that was how her translation device rendered it in Standard. She was a species from a star system far beyond the edge of human-explored space. Her people had been a spacefaring civilization for thousands of years, building great ships that traveled between the stars, trading with other species, exploring the unknown reaches of the galaxy. But those days were over now. "The synthesis found us," said. They were sitting in the station's small common area, sharing a meal of reconstituted rations. It had been 2 weeks since the crash, and was strong enough to move around with the help of a crutch Frank had fashioned from spare metal. A machine intelligence, vast and cold and hungry. They consume everything in their path, strip entire worlds of resources, convert biological life into raw materials for their expansion. Frank listened without interrupting. He had heard stories about the synthesis during the wars, rumors of a threat beyond the frontier that made humanity's petty conflicts seem trivial by comparison. He had always assumed they were just stories, propaganda meant to keep soldiers focused on the enemy in front of them. "Our fleet fought them for centuries," continued. "We held the line at the edge of our territory, kept them from reaching but they are patient and they are many. For every ship we destroyed, they built 10 more. For every world we defended, they found another path around our defenses." She paused, her amber eyes going distant. Frank saw grief there, deep and raw and recent. 3 months ago they broke through. Our main fleet was engaged on the far side of the system when they struck. By the time we received word, ours was already burning. Her voice cracked. 3 billion of my people, gone in a single day. "I'm sorry," Frank said. The words felt inadequate, but he did not know what else to say. "I was on scout patrol when it happened. By the time I reached there was nothing left but ash and debris. The survivors had scattered, fled in whatever ships they could find. I tried to follow them, but my navigation systems were damaged in a skirmish with synthesis drones. I have been drifting for weeks, lost in the void between stars. Until you crashed into my station. Nodded. I thought I was going to die alone, never knowing what happened to the rest of my people. And then I woke up here, in this strange place, with a strange alien man who had saved my life for no reason he could explain. Frank shrugged. I've never been good at explaining myself, just ask my ex-wife. He paused. Well, you can't. She died 10 years ago. But if you could, she'd tell you I was stubborn as a mule and twice as dense. His lips curved in what might have been a smile. Mule, dense, I do not understand these terms. Never mind. Point is, I did what I did because it was the right thing to do. Doesn't need to be more complicated than that. They sat in silence for a while, eating their food and watching the stars through the viewport. Frank thought about his wife, about the way she used to look at him when he said something particularly foolish. He wondered what she would think of him now, sharing a meal with an alien dragon girl in a rusted-out space station at the edge of the universe. She would probably laugh, he decided, and then she would tell him to stop being an idiot and help the girl get back on her feet. So what now? Frank asked. You got any way to contact your people, let them know you're alive? Shook her head. My long-range communications were destroyed in the crash. Even if they were functional, I do not know where to send a signal. The survivors could be anywhere by now, scattered across 1,000 systems. What about your ship? Any chance we can repair it? Perhaps. The main drive is damaged, but not beyond recovery. The navigation systems will need to be rebuilt from scratch. It would take weeks, maybe months, even with a full team of engineers. Frank grunted. Well, I'm not a full team, but I'm not bad with an engine, and it's not like I've got anything better to do. Looked at him with those amber eyes. You would help me, even though it means I will leave once the repairs are complete. That's the point of fixing something, isn't it, so it can work again. Frank pushed himself to his feet, his joints popping and cracking. Come on, let's go take a look at your ship. The next few weeks settled into a new routine. Every morning, Frank and would meet in the common area for breakfast. Then they would make their way to Docking Bay 3, where the wreckage of ship waited for them. Frank had sealed the hull breach and restored atmosphere to the bay, so they could work without suits. It was slow going at first. Ship was so different from anything Frank had ever worked on that he felt like a first-year apprentice all over again. The organic components were especially challenging. He had to learn how to nurture them back to health rather than simply replacing them, coaxing the living tissue to regrow and reconnect. But Frank was a quick learner and was a patient teacher. She showed him how the ship's systems were interconnected, how energy flowed through the vessel like blood through a body. She explained the principles behind the organic technology, the way her people had learned to grow ships rather than build them. It is a symbiotic relationship, she said one afternoon, running her hand along the ship's hull. The ship is alive in a sense. It feels what we feel. It responds to our needs. In return, we care for it, maintain it, keep it healthy. Like a pet. More like a partner, smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her whole face. My ship has been with me since I came of age. We have traveled to dozens of systems together, fought countless battles, survived hardships that should have killed us both. She is part of me and I am part of her. Frank nodded slowly. He understood that kind of bond, even if he had never experienced it with a ship. He had felt it with machines, with engines and reactors and systems that he had cared for over the years. There was something intimate about working with your hands, about understanding a machine so well that you could feel when something was wrong. What's her name? He asked. His voice was soft. It means flame of hope in my language. They worked in comfortable silence after that, Frank handling the mechanical repairs while tended to the organic components. The ship began to heal, slowly but surely, its hull sealing over the damage, its systems coming back online one by one. And as the ship healed, so did. Her broken leg mended and she set aside the crutch. Her ribs stopped aching when she breathed. Her wings, though still too damaged for flight, were no longer painful to move. She started helping Frank with the station repairs, and he quickly discovered that she was a better engineer than he was. Her people had been building starships for thousands of years, and that knowledge was bred into her bones. She could look at a broken system and immediately see what was wrong, could trace power flows and identify inefficiencies that Frank had missed entirely. Together, they brought the station back to life. The reactor climbed to 70%, then 80, then 90. Lights came on throughout the complex. Heating systems that had been dormant for decades began pumping warm air through the corridors. The constant groaning of stressed metal faded as they reinforced weak points and sealed microfractures. "You have done something amazing here," said one evening as they sat on the observation deck, watching the red dwarf star that the station orbited. "This place was dying, and you brought it back to life." Frank shrugged. "It's just repairs, nothing special." "No," shook her head, her horns catching the light. "It is more than that. You saw something broken and ruined, something everyone else had abandoned, and you chose to save it. That is not nothing. That is everything." Frank did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing. They sat in silence, watching the stars, and for the first time in a very long time, Frank felt something other than the slow march toward death. He felt hope. The synthesis found them 2 months after his crash. Frank was in the reactor room, running diagnostics on the secondary power coupling, when the proximity alarm screamed to life. His heart seized in his chest. He had not heard that sound since the night arrived, and he knew immediately that this was not another refugee ship. He moved as fast as he could, his old body protesting every step. Met him in the corridor outside the command center, her amber eyes wide with fear. "I know that energy signature," she said. "It is the synthesis. They found me." Frank pushed past her into the command center. The station's sensors were old and unreliable, but they were good enough to show him what was coming. 17 ships, arranged in a precise geometric formation, approaching the station from the outer system. They were still hours away, but they were moving fast. "How did they track you here?" Frank asked. "My distress beacon." His voice was hollow. "I activated it when my ship was damaged, hopping to attract help. I thought I had turned it off before I crashed, but I must have been wrong. They have been following the signal this whole time." Frank studied the sensor readings. The ships were unlike anything in human records, angular black hulls covered in strange geometries that seemed to shift and change as he watched. They moved with perfect coordination, like a single organism with 17 bodies. "How long until they get here?" 6 hours, maybe 7. It depends on how quickly they want to arrive." Frank nodded slowly. His mind was racing, running through options and possibilities. Fight, flee, surrender. "No, not surrender. Never surrender." "Your ship," he said, "is it ready to fly?" Hesitated. "The main drive is functional, but the navigation systems are still incomplete. I could launch, but I would have nowhere to go." "Doesn't matter. If you can get clear of the station, you might be able to outrun them long enough to find somewhere to hide." "And what about you?" Frank smiled, a thin expression that did not reach his eyes. "I was looking for a good way to go out. Guess I found one." Stared at him. "You cannot be serious. You would die for me." "I'm dying anyway, kid. Nanoplague in my lungs, remember. The docs gave me 18 months, and that was almost a year ago. At least this way my death means something." "No." His voice was sharp, fierce. "I will not accept that. I did not survive the destruction of survive weeks drifting alone in space, survive crashing into your station just to watch you throw your life away. It's not throwing it away if it saves you." "And what makes you think I want to be saved?" Stepped forward, grabbing his arm. "You gave me my life back, Frank. You showed me that there was still kindness in this universe, still people worth knowing and caring about. I will not repay that debt by running away while you die." Frank looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the determination in her amber eyes, the set of her jaw, the way she stood with her feet planted and her wings half spread. He saw himself, 40 years younger, refusing to leave a wounded soldier behind even when the enemy was closing in. "Stubborn," he said. "I learned from the best." Frank laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised them both. "All right, we stay, we fight, but we do it smart. If we're going to die, we're going to make them pay for every inch." They spent the next 3 hours preparing. Outpost Sigma 7 had been a mining station, but before that, during the First Interstellar War, it had been a military installation. The weapons had been stripped and salvaged decades ago, but not everything was gone. Frank found a pair of mass driver cannons in a storage bay deep in the station's core, ancient but functional. He found a rack of mining charges that could be repurposed as torpedoes. He found a targeting computer that still mostly worked. Helped him install the weapons, her engineering skills making the work go faster than Frank could have managed alone. They mounted the mass drivers on the station's exterior, aimed them at the approaching fleet, and connected them to the targeting computer. "This will not be enough," said as they finished the last connections. "The synthesis has 17 warships. We have 2 mass drivers and a handful of improvised torpedoes." "I know," Frank wiped the sweat from his forehead, "but I've fought against long odds before. Sometimes you get lucky." Luck's voice was thoughtful. "My people have a saying, luck is the residue of preparation." "Smart people, your folks." "We were's voice caught, we were." They finished the preparations with an hour to spare. Frank took position in the command center, his hands resting on the weapon's controls. Stood beside him, monitoring the sensor displays, her wings spread slightly as if ready for flight. The synthesis fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system and began their approach. They came slowly, methodically, like predators stalking wounded prey. Their black hulls absorbed the light from the dying star, making them look like holes in the fabric of space itself. 17 ships, said quietly. 14 destroyers, 2 cruisers, 1 command vessel. Which one do I shoot first? The command vessel. The synthesis operates with a networked intelligence. Destroy the command vessel, and the others will be momentarily confused. Frank adjusted his aim. The targeting computer struggled with the distance, the lock flickering in and out. He would have 1 shot, maybe 2, before the fleet closed to weapons range. "Come on," he muttered, "just a little closer." The fleet advanced, 100,000 kilometers, 80,000, 60,000. At 50,000 kilometers, Frank fired. The mass drivers roared to life, sending streams of hypersonic projectiles into the void. The first salvo struck the command vessel's shields, splashing against an invisible barrier. The second salvo did the same, but the third salvo found a weakness, punching through the shields and tearing into the hull. The command vessel shuddered, smoke and debris venting from a dozen wounds. Its formation wavered, the other ships hesitating for a crucial moment. "Now," shouted. Frank launched the torpedoes. The mining charges were not designed for combat, but they packed enough explosive power to crack asteroids. They detonated among the destroyer screen, catching 3 ships in the blast radius. 2 were vaporized instantly. The third tumbled away, crippled and dying. But the remaining ships recovered quickly, their networked intelligence adapting to the loss of the command vessel. They spread out, approaching the station from multiple angles, their weapons charging. The first beam struck the station's hull, cutting through metal like a knife through paper. Alarms screamed. Hull breaches flashed on the display. Frank returned fire, the mass drivers tracking from target to target, scoring hits but doing little damage against the destroyer's armor. "They're going to overwhelm us," said. Her voice was calm, steady. "We have maybe 5 minutes before they breach the core." Frank nodded. He had known this was coming, known from the moment he saw 17 ships on the sensors. But he had hoped, foolishly, that maybe this time would be different. "It was good knowing you, kid," he said. Reached out and took his hand. "And you, old man." They watched the fleet close in, watched the beams cut deeper into the station's hull, watched their death approaching with cold, mechanical precision. And then the stars exploded. They came out of hyperspace like a wall of fire. Human warships, dozens of them, their hulls painted with the blue and gold insignia of the Earth Defense Fleet. They slammed into the synthesis formation from behind, weapons blazing, fighters pouring from their launch bays. Frank stared at the display in disbelief. What the hell? A voice crackled over the communications system. "Outpost Sigma-7, this is Admiral Lisa of the Earth Defense Fleet. Looks like you could use some help." "Admiral," Frank's voice was rough. "How did you find us?" "Your guest's distress beacon. We've been tracking synthesis movements for months, trying to predict their next target. When we detected their fleet converging on your position, we decided to crash the party." There was a hint of amusement in the Admiral's voice. "Didn't expect to find a crazy old vet holding them off with mining equipment, but I've seen stranger things." The battle turned. The human fleet tore into the synthesis from behind, their modern weapons cutting through shields and armor that Frank's improvised defenses could barely scratch. The synthesis tried to reform, to bring their superior numbers to bear, but the attack had caught them off guard. One by one, the black ships fell. Destroyers exploded in brilliant flashes of light. The cruisers tried to flee, their engines flaring, but human fighters ran them down. Within 30 minutes, the entire synthesis fleet had been destroyed. Frank slumped back in his chair. His hands were shaking and his lungs burned with every breath. But he was alive. Against all odds, against all reason, he was still alive. Was crying. Tears streamed down her face, leaving trails on her scaled skin. She was saying something in her own language, words that the translator could not render, but Frank understood them anyway. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Admiral offered to evacuate them both. Her ships had medical facilities that could treat Frank's lung condition, buy him more time. They had contacts with other refugees, survivors of the who had gathered at a hidden base in the outer systems. Frank declined. "I appreciate the offer, Admiral, but this is my home now. I've got work to do here." Studied him for a long moment through the... She was a hard woman by decades of war, but Frank saw something in her eyes that might have been respect. "Understood, mister. We'll be back through this sector in 6 months. Try not to die before then." "No promises." Surprised everyone, including Frank, by declining as well. "I have no home to return to," she said. "My world is gone, my fleet is scattered, but here in this place I have found something I thought I had lost forever. I have found someone worth staying for." Frank felt something shift in his chest. It was not the nanoplague, not the burning in his lungs. It was something else, something he had not felt in a very long time. "You sure about this?" he asked. "I'm not exactly good company. Grumpy old man with bad lungs and a habit of getting into fights he can't win." Smiled, "I am sure." The fleet departed, leaving Frank and alone on the station once more. They stood together on the observation deck, watching the ships jump to hyperspace one by one until only the stars remained. "So what now?" asked. Frank thought about it. He thought about the repairs that still needed to be done, the systems that still needed to be fixed. He thought about teaching to play poker, about learning more about her people's history, about watching her wings heal so she could fly again. He thought about all the time he had left, however much or little that might be. "Now we get back to work," he said. "There's a reactor that needs tuning, a ship that needs finishing, and I still haven't figured out how to cook anything that doesn't taste like cardboard." Laughed. It was a beautiful sound, like bells chiming in the wind. "Then we had better get started," she said. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were warm, her scales smooth against his weathered skin. And for the first time in a very long time, Frank looked forward to tomorrow. They walked back into the station together, leaving the stars behind them. There was work to do, a life to build, a future to discover. The universe was vast and cold and dangerous, full of things that wanted to kill them. But they would face it together. And that, Frank decided, was enough.